Hi, we're Empirical Spirits from Copenhagen. I'd like to thank Alex and Monica for inviting us and for continuing to hold what is the most compelling symposium in the drinks business. I'd also like to say happy birthday to Andrew. Is that you, Andrew? Andrew's our head distiller, and he's here tonight. Fermentation is often thought of this black box, this kind of magic space where you just kind of put things and they evolve, they change, they happen. What we're going to try and do today is lift a small corner of that black box. In a very strict biochemical sense, fermentation is a metabolic process where microbes convert sugars into another substance in the absence of oxygen. In a colloquial sense, fermentation is a formation of food by microbes and the enzymes produced by microbes. For all of you who are doing fermentations in your bars, in your wardrobes, in your bathrooms, or wherever it is, there's 6 critical things that you need to understand and control in any fermentation. That's salt, pH, oxygen, the substrate, that is there sugar, is there food for the microbe, humidity, and temperature.
And throughout the talk, I'm going to nip in and out and talk about how this relates into making delicious things in the glass or on our plates.
But ultimately, why care about fermentation, right? Like, it's easy enough to get a bottle of wine, it's easy enough to get a bottle of beer. We buy chocolate, we buy bread. This is a culinary representation of what the world is like to me without fermentation, without my control of fermentation. It's boring, it's staid, there's no excitement. It's like that. We also don't consider that when we're buying bread or wine or plucking a leaf of the mint or the basil or whatever it is, herb or spice that you're putting into a cocktail or a drink, that it's not just plucking the leaf. There's this intense and very complicated biochemical machine that's creating all these flavor compounds. This is millions, billions of years of evolution that's led up to this. What fermentation allows us to do is kind of pull back the hood from that engine, stick our hands in, and kind of start controlling that process.
So over an incredibly long time, the evolving of microbes, humans are gaining understanding of fermentation to make more appetizing things than the hot dog and mash cake you just seen, which is kind of a bit strange. So we're going to now move into how we at Empirical use this knowledge through spirits as a vessel.
So this is Ariel Johnson, a food scientist that I had the pleasure of working with for a number of years, and what she's holding up is flavor compounds that ants use as communications stressors, essentially. This is how we became friends, because I was geeking out about something and she geeked about something in her field, and we became close collaborators. But the point is this, that ants have created things that we consider flavor compounds, like lemongrass, like leather, like mint, for communication purposes. We can create the same things with microbes in terms of processing substrates and using microbes within certain parameters to achieve those flavors. It's one of the important things, and we're going to talk about this throughout the evening, is that fermentation is primarily a nurturing endeavor. We are dealing with living microbes, and each one of those needs certain parameters to be healthy, to be successful. It's like trying to raise children and getting them into a good kindergarten so they can go to a good university. We have to provide like a stability for them, the great food, the great environment, and make sure that they're happy in every step of the way. This is an example of this. This is outside of the fermentation room of someone who's considered the world's best katsuobushi producer. Katsuobushi is a Japanese process. It's a little bit too involved to get to this evening. But this is the music list that he plays to the microbes that are fermenting the katsuobushi. So he feels that Mozart is this beautiful, serene environment where his microbes will be at their best. This isn't to suggest that Mozart versus Chopin versus Beethoven or whatever is particularly good for this microbe, but I use it to illustrate the amount of care that this man is putting into his process, that he's so focused on what we think of as mold, that he's playing a playlist that he curates every day for these microbes. Talking about compounds, I'm going to run through a bunch of slides very quickly. These are some common things that different basic microbes produce: lactic acid, acetic acid, glutamic acids, and then alcohols, which are often converted into sugar. A lot of these flavors, as we run through it, diacetyl, cheesy, creamy, buttery, fruity. A lot of these you'll sort of recognize from wine tasting. If we want to really geek out about it, this is a table that Ariel and I compounded about the different fermentations that were going on at Restaurant Noma at the time. And you start seeing yogurt-like flavors, leather-like flavors, fireplace flavors. All of these are products that are created not from particularly the substrate, so that is, it's not necessarily the grapes, which, not to take anything from wine growers, is part of the main focal point of the process, but it's the way that the microbes themselves are cultivated that produces all of these flavors.
So as you can see from this here slide, that there's a lot of testing going on, because as there's, depending on the substrate, the fermentation tool, i.e. like types of microbes, the pH, everything that Lars mentioned earlier, there's a many different array of outcomes that can be possible. So through this here, this is just a small example that we'll get into in more detail later of what we actually go into at Empirical to try and get the certain flavors that we're striving to achieve. But a fun fact about this picture, I don't think any single thing in this whole entire picture ever made it past the testing phase. And that's just the kind of the constant dance with microbes that we have, that is fermentation.
Yeah, side note on creativity, it's a 99% failure.
As you can see.
We'll jump into probably the most difficult microbe that we deal with at Empirical Spirits. When I began the distillery, I knew that I wanted to have koji as part of the process because it has this beautiful, delicate floral characteristics, can lend a sense of mushroom, umami. All of these are secondary metabolics created by the Aspergillus mold. As it's doing its main thing of converting the starches into simple sugar chains so that, well, for its own purposes, it can feed itself, but for our purposes, we can use it for, say, producing sake. We mix that with malted barley in our grain bill when we're brewing. But this was something, this kind of layering of complexity through fermentation was something that is core to what we do at Empirical Spirits and is also core to how we act as a company. Here, you can see Rekka, who's our koji queen. And she's decided that our koji doesn't prefer Mozart, but prefers death metal. And I kind of second her on that. But what I'm highlighting is the care and attention and dedication that she puts into this and that she puts in every day. It's like the awareness that we're dealing with a living creature. Sometimes we'll have relatively famous chefs and scientists and people coming through our distillery, and they all want to kind of poke their heads into the koji room because it's this real highlight in our space. And Rekka will kind of sternly and steadfastly put her hand out and say, no, Mama's asleep at the moment. Because she understands that with all fermentation, but particularly for her with the koji, it's about nurturing this collaboration. Because fermentation is a collaboration. You're collaborating with the microbes in a careful and measured way to create different flavors. If you raise the temperature in koji, you produce different compounds. With different species of Aspergillus, say Aspergillus luciensis, If you curl off in the tail of the fermentation by 4 degrees, it produces citric acid. So you get a completely different flavor profile by the small adjustments to the environment and how carefully you're sort of tending your microbe. Oops. Sorry, I skipped over that.
So this is moving into miso. This is kind of a breakdown of how, a very simplistic breakdown, but very efficient of how miso is made. We're lucky enough to grow, thanks to Rekka, a shitload of koji. So we have the option to make a lot of miso. Fortunately, we're looking into dealing with a lot of our spent products that breweries and distilleries have in a way to utilize this and to actually bring a second product out of it. So such examples of this would be like our spent grain. Spent grain is a huge issue for breweries and distilleries, but we can make spent grain miso or spent grain shoyu, which is absolutely delicious. Also, another one is like we're working on like things with katsu. We can make katsu miso, which is like absolutely amazing. Most recently, we did a collaboration with Taylor and Elementary, and there was carob in that blend. Carob brings a beautiful, earthy chocolate note, which is going to make a beautifully rich miso. That's a botanical that most distilleries that deal with botanicals, they just throw them out afterwards. But we're fortunate enough to be able to utilize these and to actually bring a product because it's good to do, essentially.
Yeah, and as a side note, well, we've been quite able to transform a large part of our waste stream using fermentation into different new and novel uses for ourselves. It's important to note that fermentation isn't something that you can do with that thing that's been sitting around in the back of your fridge for 3 weeks and you finally notice it and you say, oh, maybe I can ferment this. It's got to be as fresh and beautiful as possible. If you wouldn't want to eat it immediately, you can't ferment it. This goes doubly for something like, say, squid garum. I think that's one of the misnomers where you're like, oh, it's rotting fish. No. If you take rotten fish and try and make fish garum, you'll have something that smells like a whale washed up into your kitchen and died. Whereas if you take the very fresh sort of squid scraps in this illustration, carefully keep them at the right temperature, you add koji, the right amount of salt, the right amount of liquid, put it in the right temperature, you'll get the most beautiful, velvety, unctuous, umami-rich sauce you've ever tried.
So, going back to earlier that you've seen was pearled barley that we were going aspergillus zarze on. This is actually mandioca. So it's just a different substrate that we're growing the same mold on, but it gives a highly different flavor profile. So as on the pearled barley, you get this like nutty, sweet umami-ness, but with mandioca, it actually highlights the tropical fruitness of this root that when raw is actually toxic, but due to inoculating it with the koji spores, it bypasses that, and then you can actually have this beautiful tropical note. Just by switching the substrate, you have a completely different realm of flavors that are achievable.
And this is something that we try and do as much as we can at Empirical, is by juxtaposing different traditions and products with each other. So we're taking a real staple of South American cuisine, manioc, and we're applying a very Eastern, particularly Japanese technique to it. This allows us to taste the manioc in a very novel way because we don't have to cook it the way that you normally have to cook manioc, because manioc naturally has quite a bit of cyanide in it, and so there's usually a heavy cooking process to break that cyanide down. This, essentially koji fermentation, breaks down the cyanide in the same way, also transforming the starches into sugars, which allows us to make this beautiful wine and then kind of what's essentially a shochu. We've also brought back some really beautifully naturally fermented honey from Brazil. So we're extracting the yeast from that for a secondary trial. We're actually using Brazilian yeast from honey to ferment the Japanese cured manioc, if that is really easy to follow.
Long-winded, but great flavor.
This beauty, the gentleman before us just touched on, this is a Scobie, which is colloquially called a Kombucha Mother. Scobie stands for symbiotic construct of bacteria and yeast, so that basically a parallel fermentation. There's some misconception that this mother is actually the organism that produces the fermentation. It's actually a byproduct of the parallel fermentation. So this is a zoological mat of mostly cellulose and more or less inactive yeast and bacteria. It actually forms like a capsicle on top of the whatever vessel you're doing the kombucha fermentation in, sort of protecting the more active microbes that are in the liquid state. Kombucha is kind of one of my favorite fermentations, just because it's very resilient and very adaptable. With nurturing, taking care of it, you can make it very able to process a really wide range of products. So it's very happy working on 100% fruit juices, 100% vegetable juices, with a little bit of coaxing and cajoling and a small amount of bullying. I was able to get a couple mothers to start consuming lactose, so I could grow them on milk, which allowed you to make sort of creme fraiches, yogurts, fresh cheeses. Yeah.
So just if you look at this illustration, you'll see that it says blackcurrant leaves, but just as something I find that is a good way to illustrates how kombucha can utilize flavors and can bring out certain flavors. Instead of using blackcurrant leaves, recently we used pineapple weed. Pineapple weed it grows everywhere in the Nordics at this time of year. It's a little weed. It's in the chamomile family. But when you make kombucha out of that air, if you hold it at around 24 degrees for 48 hours, it'll start tasting less like chamomile tea, and will actually take on the beautiful acidity that fresh pineapple juice has, and it'll be that fruity. So we can use kombucha to bring out flavors that we can't actually achieve that's around us.
Now we get to the mainstay, so alcohol. Yeast is generally considered for its ability to create alcohol, but in the hands of really skilled brewers like Yuki, like Rodrigo, it's actually a flavor generation machine. It can show incredible complexity in its metabolic pathways. I mean, for all intents and purposes, beer is just sweet barley water. Wine is just grape juice, right? The differences between them in the same substrate depend on the care that the person doing the brewing or winemaking is applying to it. Low sugar creates different compounds than high sugar. Temperature creates different compounds, whether it's high or low. How much acidity it then produces. Each stress changes the way that the yeast works. Essentially, we're using a metabolic machine that's been evolving for a number of different purposes and allowing us to, again, put our hands on the controls. This is the metabolic pathway of a yeast cell. I just pulled this up quickly to kind of demonstrate each one of these paths is a direction that you can push the flavor in. I'm going to start running very quickly because we're about to spool out of time. So this is an African fruit called matamba. We're starting to collect a lot of different microbe samples from every time we go traveling somewhere. So we're harvesting samples from a wine that they make out of matamba, and then also a wine that is traditionally made in village. This is Mafura. Both of these fruits are from Zimbabwe, as one of the projects that we are working with at Empirical Spirits. The idea is to basically collect yeast samples and have a sense of terroir that's a microbial terroir as opposed to a product terroir. Just going to run through lactic steps.
Go.
So lactic fermentation is just very simply an illustration of how confining certain parameters in the fermentation will lead to success or failure. Most microbes hate salinity, need oxygen. Lactic acid bacteria deals with this situation very well. We often make a decision in our distillery whether we're going to distill vinegars or kombuchas. This is habanero vinegar. That difference is just based on empirical testing of trial and error about whether a particular complexity in fermentation, say kombucha is a parallel fermentation. So we're going through 2 subsequent fermentations at the same time. There's a bit more processing, a bit more influenced by the microbe. Sometimes that works well for a particular substrate. Sometimes we find for that particular project, something like a vinegar fermentation will work a bit better. 5 seconds to look at how vinegar's made. When we're creating flavor and both creating sort of the process of doing fermentations, I tend to think of it in a very visual sense, which I also referred back to in my former literary degree. So we think of it as a narrative arc. I think this also creates a visual sense of how the fermentation curve in terms of applying different stressors or food substrates creates a curve which is producing flavor compounds. We also think of that as essentially high points and low points, and taking someone on a journey with us and invoking a sense memory through flavor. Very quickly, this is why we use alcohol, even though we consider ourselves a flavor company. Each one of these H's is a hydrogen bomb, which is essentially like a piece of Velcro or a very sticky hook, which bond to other organic compounds, that is, flavors. So this is a fancy little graph proving that alcohol is a great way to preserve flavor. This is what Andrew spends a bulk of his day doing. This is just how we sort of separate the cuts. But this is sort of touching back on what Chris was saying earlier. When we separate the distillation of something like habanero vinegar, you get the skin of the habanero, and then you get almost like a fruit tone, and then a green tone, and then the tone of the seeds. Then you get often weird tones like melon tones. By cutting the distillation into, say, 50 cuts in the hearts, it allows us to actually dial in the flavor. And as I run completely out of time, sorry guys. Oops. This is the team of women and men at Empirical Spirits, and I'd just like to say thanks to them because they're the heart and soul and of everything that we do. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.